First of all, let me thank Hari and Reg for inviting me to participate in this, I think, quite important forum for which the occasion is absolutely right. I think they have picked up on a very, very key theme of our time. I want to begin by pointing out that as a student of modern politics in contemporary modern capitalist societies, I've always noticed that it has been quite usual on the part of business to talk about poverty, largely in a charity format. So, for example, this year, the Financial Times Best Business Book of the Year award went to a book called Poor Economics, which is basically a very hopeful primer on how what businesses can do to fight poverty all around the world. But I think that this forum represents a very important transition from talking about from businesses and people connected with businesses, talking about poverty, to talking about inequality. I think the recent crisis has made business people generally realize that they too are paying a cost, paying the cost of inequality. So in the past, of course, over the last 30 years, as we know, as we will see in a couple of charts I have to show, there has been a lot of concern about inequality. And so one of the most popular and important books to have been published in recent years, looking back over those 30 years, is Wilkinson and Pickett's The Spirit Level. But does Occupy, what Occupy means to business, how should businesses respond, is, I think, for the second phase, in a sense, the concerns about inequality that arise from a new phase of inequality that is emerging out of the austerity that is being imposed around the world in response to the crisis. I think that this is a very, very important initiative, so it gets first prize from me. And I also note that the OECD just a couple of days ago has issued a report about basically chiding all member governments about increases in inequality. And saying that, in fact, also, for instance, things like wage inequality used to be countered by government policy, government fiscal policy particularly, in a variety of ways, but under the climate of austerity, after 30 years of neoliberalism, this is no longer happening. So that's very important. Just a couple of charts quickly to show you the dimensions of what we are talking about. Here is a chart I picked off just from Wikipedia, which shows the share of the top 1%, that's the blue line, the top 0.1%, that's the pink line, and the top 0.01% in US society between 1917 and 2005. And what I'd like you to note is the bottoming out of those income shares precisely during the 50s and the 60s, when in fact businesses were much more highly regulated by the state than they are today. And of course, you notice that before and after that phase, you have much greater shares of these very, very rich people out of the total national income. This chart is from the new OECD report. It shows what I want to draw your attention to here is the extent to which the English-speaking countries, in particular UK, US, and Canada, are particularly they display particularly higher rates of inequality. Canada is where I've drawn that arrow. And you can see here what's interesting as well is that these are trends in inequality for the US, that's the blue line, Canada, the red line, and the OECD average. Not only are both Canada and the US above the trend line, not only is Canada tracking the US more or less, but what's really interesting is that after sort of really staying more or less level through most of through most of this period shown here from 1975 to about 1990, including the Mulroney years, the Gini coefficient goes up, particularly during the great liberal deficit cutting era. And I just want to point out, here's just a very simple chart of world growth with the line showing you a 5-year running average. And again, the more equality, because you remember from one of the previous charts that these were eras of more equality, you also had more growth during these times. And you can see the 5-year moving average takes a distinct step downwards in the neoliberal era, basically. What is the political economy of inequality? By the way, I should say that if thinking about it, I know that inequality affects business in a variety of ways. It affects business politically. It affects business politically, for instance, by giving people with a lot of liquid capital, particularly financial businesses, much greater power than real economy businesses have. The businesses are affected socially. They have to, as Hari pointed out in yesterday's conversation, they have to pay much more for the security costs and so on. They are affected in a whole bunch of ways, but I'm going to focus mainly on political economy because people assume that actually inequality is good for business. Let's drive a few more nails in the coffin of that idea. Inequality basically decreases demand, as you can imagine, which in turn decreases productive investment because businesses don't expect demand, therefore they don't have any desire to invest. Sorry about the inverted, I didn't know what to do. I need a skill upgrading here myself, but that increases a financial investment, which is largely unproductive. That in turn increases financial wealth, which in turn increases the amount of political power people who hold exclusively financial wealth have, which of course then once they have that power, and when something goes wrong, one string violin is simply more austerity, more austerity, more austerity, which simply then leads to further increases in inequality. And here I'd just like to show you very quickly a short a clip from a video with the economist Nouriel Roubini, who I've decided I'm going to call the Cassandra of the business classes, because he foresaw the present crisis, he was laughed at on TV, etc. And this is him in more recent times saying something quite interesting. Oh,
from wages to profits, inequality of income and wealth has increased, and the marginal propensity to spend of a household is greater than the marginal propensity to spend of a firm, because they have a higher marginal propensity to save, firms compared to households. So that the distribution of income and wealth makes the problem of excessive lack of aggregate demand even worse. So, I mean, Karl Marx had it right. At some point, capitalism can self-destroy itself, because you cannot keep on shifting income from labor to capital without not having an excess capacity and a lack of aggregate demand. And that's what's happening. We thought that markets work.
That's all. So basically, the point that he's making, which is simply that you just cannot keep shifting income from labor to capital and expect that everything will be fine. I talked about the political economy of inequality. I now want to introduce something else, which comes out of a potential title of a book I'm just finishing. I call it the geopolitical economy of inequality, because we all know that markets are interconnected. They are not global in my view, but they are quite interconnected. And here is Robert Brenner, who's very interesting. He's an economic historian. And more than 10 years ago, he wrote a book called The Economics of Global Turbulence, which keeps being updated and published in new editions. And in the 2009 introduction to the Spanish edition, entitled What's Good for Goldman Sachs is Good for America, which is effectively a critique of the idea that an economy based largely on centered around financial wealth creation can be sustainable, he says the following: against this background, and by this background he means a background of increasing inequality and depressing demand, of both ever slower increase of the world market and individual economies ever increasing reliance on it, because of course everybody in this era was told that they all had to export, they had to become export-oriented economies, which of course tends to contribute to inequality, because if as I'll come to in a second, if the country's citizens had to be purchasers of the things capitalists produce, they would have to be, they would have to get wealthier as capitalism progressed. So individual economies' ever greater reliance on it, economic accelerations in major regions had increasingly to take place as a zero-sum game, because the growth of the global economic pie, global GDP, continued to decelerate. These local expansions this typically occurred by way of a hydraulic dynamic in which one leading economy or group of them took advantage of reduced exchange rate to undertake manufacturing-led export-oriented expansions, but heavily at the expense of others with correspondingly increased interest rates. This is the sort of politics of the Plaza Accord, the reverse Plaza Accord, will Japanese interest rates, exchange rate going up, down, etc., etc. This is what has happened over the last several decades, and obviously now countries are going to be much more reluctant to even pursue that. I'd like, Rubini said Marx was right. I think Marx and Keynes both had a excellent understanding of this particular aspect of the problem of that capitalism has, that businesses have within capitalism. And Marx says in certain notes he wrote before the writing of Capital, he said, it is every capitalist's illusion, every capitalist wishes to restrict his own workers' consumption. Of course, he would like the workers of other capitalists to be the greatest consumers possible of his own commodity. But this is just how the illusion arises, that apart from his workers, the whole remaining working class confronts him as a consumer and a participant in exchange, as a money spender, not as a worker. But capital itself then regards demand by the worker, that is the payment of the wages on which the demand rests, not as a gain, but as a loss. What precisely distinguishes capital from the master-servant relation, a feudal relation, is that the worker confronts him as a consumer. But of course, if you're constantly trying to push wages down, then you ain't got consumers, and that's basically the problem. Rubini pointed out that you can't keep shifting income from labor to capital without creating a problem of aggregate demand. Here is a chart from in an article by two economists, Gerard Dumenil and Dominique Levy, showing the top 0.01% income share in total household income excluding capital gains, and the three main components. And what I want to draw your attention to is basically this, that the capital gain in the 20s and 30s was, capital income was quite high. Then during the most productive and expansionary phases of the world economy and Western economies, it was exceedingly low. And then after the 1980s, it began rising.